Hi everyone, I'm Smriti. I'm the marketing lead at Bound, and I'm a writer, researcher, and a marketing professional that has worked with senior women leaders across India. I'm passionate about gender, fiction, and books in particular that make a difference, which is why I absolutely loved Frida, the main female protagonist from All Men Are Worshippers, a love story which explores the happily ever after part of a very complex relationship. Um, in a nuclear, in a world of nuclear families, have you ever heard of a household where a woman lives with her seven sons, husband, and lover? Even though Frida is in a coma, we get to hear about her extraordinary life through the narration by her lover Mahesh. This is a story about unconventional relationships told in the second person narrative. We have with us today Dinesh Prasad, the author of All Men Are Worshippers. Dinesh's first book, East of Love, West of Desire, was a collection of novellas on the partition of India, published in 2015. He writes short stories, poetry, and novels. His writing is lyrical and rooted in the experiments in magical realism, surrealism, and romanticism. I had a fantastic time reading your novel, especially the way you use language. It was really a lovely read. So while some authors use the first person I or the third person they, Dinesh has used the second person really well in All Men Are Worshippers. So let's find out more about the second person narration in the book. Welcome, Dinesh. Lovely to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you for such a lovely introduction to the book. Really appreciate that.
It was a really engaging read. The sort of language that you use is quite poetic, and I really enjoyed it. It was a very different experience for me. What was the process of writing a book in the second person narrative for you? Did you find it a little difficult, or what was going on?
So it was quite difficult. And there was a lot of rework that I had to do. So let me talk to you about the process that I had undertaken. I was writing the book in the first person to begin with.
Oh wow!
Yes. And it was the first person from all the three different characters. So I was juxtaposing the chapters where each character speaks in the chapter in the first person. And then I realized that while that is a viable way to tell the story, um, there could have been a better way. And then I thought of I had discounted the third person right from the beginning because this is not the story that would appeal in the third person. So so the only other option that I had was the second person. And I said, all right, let's experiment with that. And when I started writing in second person, uh, it was it was tough because getting the perspectives of, let's say, Alfie or Frida into that second person required a lot of rework and rethinking to ensure that it doesn't come across as disjointed or staccato. So, so I had completed nearly 60% of the manuscript when I went back and changed it to second person.
That sounds
So,
like a really long ordeal. Can I ask how long it took you to redo the whole thing?
it took me quite some time because while I had to run sentence by sentence to change it to ensure that the syntax is correct, to ensure that the story is flowing. Um, in the first edits, I still found a lot of I's and I found a lot of V's, uh, which had to be fixed. But yeah, it was an interesting exercise.
But I really do think that your exercise paid off because the perspective really changed the way that we see Frida. And oftentimes, I think while using a second person narrative, it creates an intimacy between the reader and the protagonist, and you become a part of the story. So
Yeah.
that was really great. And how do you think that influences the reader's perception of Frida's life and story, as opposed to how they might have viewed it if you would have used the first person.
Yeah. I think the other interesting part, Smriti, was while Frida is the protagonist,
Hmm.
she doesn't speak at all in the book, except
Right.
probably in the last part, 2 pages. But I don't think she speaks about it. And uh, the reason that I had used that was you could still talk about strong women from the male gaze perspective. And the nuance was to not uh, create unidimensional characters, right?
Right.
So each character that you have is fairly layered, and they have to be layered because in the real world, um, nobody is linear, nobody is unidimensional. And the second person narrative would is more impactful when you don't bring the main protagonist in the forefront. There are other people talking about it, and while it's the distillation of their experiences and their thoughts, uh, the trick is also to ensure that the main protagonist still remains central to the theme of what you're writing. Right. So I enjoyed doing that. Uh, in my view, there is no dilution in the strength of Frida's character.
Yes.
Uh, I believe that the little things that I have used in terms of the photograph on the mantle,
Mhm.
the children on the dining table, Frida on red bed sheets, Frida making the flower bouquets, Frida standing quite stubbornly to get her own uh, way. I think um, the second person brings it out very well because it doesn't. Yeah, the trick was also not to make it gossipy. The trick was not to make it judgmental,
Mhm.
but to continue to present the character um, in the way she would have behaved. So, yeah, it was very interesting. The other difficult part in writing second person was talking about Alfie,
Right.
right? So that was the most difficult part, and I think I have brought in enough empathy for Alfie despite the second person narration from Mahesh. So yeah, um, I am happy with the way the characters have turned out.
I totally agree. I do feel you do feel a sense of empathy for Alfie, if not only sympathy, even though the narration is from Mahesh, who obviously does have some resentment towards this person who is Frida's husband. So I think that came
Yeah,
through beautifully.
yeah.
So I wanted to ask a sort of a fun question. Sometimes when we feel secondary characters steal the show, and we've seen this across all forms of media. We've seen it in literature and movies. So if you had to do a small side story from the perspective of one of your side characters, of one of the secondary characters from the book, who do you think would be, the most apt voice for this?
There are a lot of those characters for the
Yeah.
secondary story. Gypsy is the primary one. I absolutely love Gypsy
Such a
because
fun character.
he's quite enigmatic. Uh, his story is um, quite magical, and I have portrayed it in a very small amount, but I could write an entire book on the Gypsy. Uh, Similarly, if you look at Buddy Bai, her life is quite interesting. we could write about her. There is Sushila auntie. Yeah, so there are quite a few characters. There is Urja's mother. Um, so there are a few characters who could have very, very strong stories. But if I were to write which could be a potential full-fledged, well-fleshed out character, it would be Girija.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, because if you recall Girija's story, I think it can be a fantastic piece of fiction in itself.
There are so many secondary characters in the book.
Yeah.
You can understand that you're hard pressed to choose. I think I'd be hard
Mm.
pressed to even pick if I had to read only one story out of all of them. They were also fun and they were also interwoven in the story. They didn't feel like strangers, like sometimes how you feel when characters walk in and out of books.
Yeah,
I think that was one of my favorite parts of the whole thing.
yeah. I think writing the plethora of characters that are there in the book and each leaving a mark
Yes.
uh, was quite enjoyable.
So, when people write, they pick up inspiration from a lot of things. Like Neil Gaiman picked up the story for Coraline from a really creepy Victorian story. Some people sit in traffic and then they have a eureka moment. For All Men Are Worshippers, did you have anything that inspired you, or was it just, I want to tell this story and this is how I'm going to go about it? What was your process in writing this book?
I wanted to write a story, right? I wanted to write a story about a strong woman. And when I was thinking about it, you see there are a lot of fiction out there around men having multiple partners or extramarital affairs. Women are not portrayed in that space well. Also, even if you have a woman portrayed, there is a decisioning that they have to go through in terms of selecting one or the other partner,
Right.
right? Whereas if you look at some of the older traditions in South India, a man could have two wives, right? In certain religious communities, there's a sanction to have multiple wives. Now, if you think it from a woman's perspective, would she have similar choices available to her? Right? And therefore, I went through a whole thinking process and making an idea. And then I thought, is it possible for a woman to be a mother, to be a lover, to be a wife, and to be a part of the society where she's functional in all the roles that she has taken? Right? And that's what I had to really work through to ensure that she doesn't come across as dysfunctional, right? Or she doesn't come across as something that the society will judge in a very negative light. I think that was the thought that I started with. And it was a difficult one because then you had to bring in a lover at a right point. You had to bring in the confrontation between the lover and a husband. Then you have to create some sort of um, a resolution to that. Um, and yet try and get her to live a full life. Now, you may also look at the fact that while you may take decisions in a certain way, and those decisions may be right for you, there is always a collateral damage.
Right.
And while she took the decisions in the interest, keeping a whole host of things in her perspective, uh, the sons are the collateral damage. right? And you know, at the end of the day, you decide what you want to do, live by it, stand by it, and whatever be the consequences, deal with it. And I think that's what happened in this story. But if I were to change Frida in any other way, no. I think um, she's a very, very strong character. Uh, she she did all the things that she thought was right. She balanced all the difficult, critical situations uh, to the best of her abilities. Um, and she was also quite honest with her sons and lovers and the rest of the family. So yeah, I think um, writing a woman-centric theme from a male gaze, giving her the same opportunities that the male protagonists have in fiction, and then building it from there. I think it was a lot of times the story dictated itself, uh, because uh, while I do have a certain framework in terms of how the story will progress, but as I wrote chapters after chapters, ideas emerged, characters built themselves, and here we are.
Here we are. I think that's also like the layers that you've added to Frida to make sure that she is just not the concept of a woman, if we were to frame it that way. I think that's what makes her such a compelling character and makes people really interested in it. Because we always run the risk of writing unidimensional characters that you like or you dislike. But having a character that you relate to, now that's a tough one,
Yeah.
I think, but it has come out like pretty great. I keep talking about how much I enjoyed the flow of writing and some specific sentences. But there is one that I wanted to bring up specifically.
Yeah.
Quite early on in the book, and this really stuck with me because I thought it was such a lovely, poetic way of saying it, where Mahesh says, "My stories will revive you as they did when we first met. My lips are colored with them." And it's such a visual sentence. And the book is full of such sentences where you just have to pause for a second and you have to be like, wow, it really went there. And I did not expect to see this coming, but it did. So, are there any specific instances where you thought that this sounds really fun? I hope the reader actually thinks about it, or something that was your favorite part of the book where you were like, okay, yes, this is my favorite.
But there was one part which I really enjoyed writing was after the marriage, he's lying on the bed with a cigarette in his hand and jazz playing on the gramophone, and she's making her hair. She's combing her hair, brushing her hair. I think I really enjoyed writing that scene. I think there is enough uh, sensuality in that scene.
Yes.
There is enough tension, and I thought that dynamic in that scene was quite terrific. I absolutely loved writing that. So that was the first one. The second one was again where when people spit at her, right? So a spit like a spider lands on a sandal. That was beautiful. I enjoyed thinking about it.
And it's such a visual description. You're instantly
Yeah,
transported.
yeah, yeah. So I think those are some of the things that makes your writing interesting.
Mhm.
Um, because as I said, writing linearly is possible, but how do you bring a little more interest and a little more attraction to what you're writing? I think it's the lyricism that adds to it.
Yeah.
And
So
therefore, any writer who's writing fiction should read poetry.
I agree. It's just the way you write is as important as what you write, and poetry does add a certain sort of musicality to your writing.
So I may be quite an amateurish poet, but I use that skill in writing my fiction.
Do you have any poet recommendations for us that we can just from the top of your head?
Oh, there are quite a few of them. So currently I'm reading Yehuda Amichai,
Ooh.
and I absolutely love his writing. There is another poet called Elaine Finstein. Um, there's Louise Gluck. So there are quite a few out there. Uh,
Small
but I
segue.
think, yeah, I read a lot of Neruda.
Ah,
Um,
perfect.
yeah, you should read Gabriel Garcia Lorca.
Yes.
So yeah,
Thank you for your recommendations. There are some names that I will definitely be looking up after this interview.
yeah,
Uh, So this is your second book, and different
yes.
publishers have completely different like editorial processes. And we've spoken to so many writers who share that sometimes editors don't have either they don't have time to edit or they edit so much that the writer sometimes feels a little stifled. Uh, for this particular book, did the editing process go around a little differently as compared to your first one?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the relationship between a writer and editor is a collaborative process.
Right.
And I hugely respect the editing process because that's where your book is chiseled out. So my first editor, the very first rough draft of it was so raw. And I think it would have been a torture reading it, but Tara did it. So Tara was the first one who read the manuscript.
Right.
But the kind of detailed inputs she gave me, both structurally as well as content-wise, that was super helpful. But after that, I think I spent a lot more time in terms of rewriting it, in terms of rearranging it. Um, and one of the things that happened during the editorial process uh, was to completely reshape the manuscript. So one of the advice that another writer had given me was to use flashcards, write the chapter name and the summary of what you're trying to tell in that, and lay it out on the floor. And then play around with it in terms of structuring your chapters. Um, and I did that. And in the initial drafts, the suns were coming, the content around the suns was coming towards the last one third of the book. And what was happening was while the story is fairly strongly progressing, there was a certain amount of a deflection there because the gears were being switched from these protagonists to the sons.
Right.
And then it came back to the three protagonists. And I think there was some sort of a dip that was happening there. So in that process, what I did was I just removed all the sons chapters and I said, what is the flow now? And that was flowing fine. And then just impetuously, I took all the sons chapters and bunked them in the beginning. After some of the introductions or the conversations that Mahesh is happening, I said, let's talk about the sun in terms of what we have reaped in life, and then we'll talk about the life. And I think that started flowing well. And then when it went into the editorial process, my editors approved of that. Because earlier that was the comment that, the sun, you may either have to do away with the sun's chapters, or you need to pepper it across the book, or figure out a way. You are the writer. And I think that helped. And finally, in the editing process, there were certain cliches that I was using. There were certain things that I was using which I was told not to use. Um, and I think that's how the editorial process really helped in terms of bringing out the content into a structure and shaping it where it's more reader friendly than what it was earlier. So, so the editing process was quite intense actually, because it's a difficult piece of manuscript with too much happening, right? So continuity, if you change structure, there will be continuity issues that you need to fix all across. Uh, there were elements of foreshadowing that had to be closed up. So, so yeah, I think the editorial process helped through all of that. Now, when it went for my final editing, in terms of before publishing, my editor had very little to add because it had gone through so much of um, editorial support and self-editing that it had reached a good level for them to be kind of to pick it up. And one of the things a lot of authors tell me is, as a writer, you should self-edit to a very large extent. Lean on your editors for the significant value adds which they can provide if your manuscript is fairly clean. If it is not that clean, then it becomes a struggle for the editor also to be able to kind of work through that maze and give more constructive feedback.
Right.
So I really enjoyed my editorial process, and I learned so much through that that I'm sure my next manuscript will be much tighter, much well thought of, and all of that.
I think it's great that you had such a thorough editorial process this time. So now you have a better idea of what you cannot do for your next book.
And Smriti, I have absolutely no ego issues when my editor tells me to knock off pages after pages. So there were thick chapters which have been completely removed because the editor said, "Why are you talking about this? This is not the story about Gypsy, so knock it off. Why are you talking about Buddy Bhai? It's not a story about Buddy Bhai, knock it off." Or there is this marriage scene between Girija and Mahesh, and I had written it with leisure, write like a cinematic scene for 7 days. She said, "Why are you spending? Why are you wasting your words on something which is just incidental to the plot, right?" So if it is significant, then you spend time. If it is incidental, write, do justice to what you want to write. Otherwise, you're just doing it for fun, and we don't want to see your fun in writing when it's not carrying the story.
That
So
makes a lot of sense, actually. And do you think that's something that new authors should watch out for, not being so attached to certain parts of their story so that it doesn't get derailed in the process of making sure that the story gets out?
absolutely, absolutely. I think um, trust your editor's judgment, because editors see so many manuscripts, they're able to spot a challenge very, very quickly. So respect their experience, trust what the editor is saying. It is a collaboration process. If you disagree, get into a discussion and find a resolution. I don't think we should take it on our egos that you are asking me to chop off 5,000 words. The editor is working for your benefit, right? In terms of ensuring that your manuscript reaches a spot where it should be.
Okay.
It's not criticism for the sake of criticism. Uh, And therefore, I think we should work uh, with the editors so much more collaboratively, lean on their experience, because at the end of the day, the book is really chiseled in the editing process, right? Especially the structural edits are so important because as a writer, you're so deep into writing that you don't have the time to step back and sometimes think about how best to present your content. And that's where your editor will help you, right? So I find editorial process extremely valuable, and I've been fortunate that I have had some good editors who give very constructive feedback. Sometimes they can be blunt as well, but it's their job, and it's your job as a writer to get your creativity going, given the feedback that you have received, right?
That's great advice. I think a lot of new writers should really pay attention to that one and maybe lean on their editors a little more and give a little leeway so that their story can be the best possible version.
Absolutely. And you know, there are different ways of learning. Editorial process is a huge way of learning as a writer, right? So so yeah, respect what your editor is saying.
So we have the writing process, we have the editing process. But now these days, book promotion is a really interesting aspect of publishing. Did you know that you can hire a billboard in Times Square in New York to promote your book? That's I find that really interesting in the different ways that people are doing that. So, what are your thoughts about new types of book promotion? Are you more of a traditionalist in that sense, or
So so no, no, I think if you're proud of what you've written and you want people to read, go out there and talk about it. I think your publisher will do some bits. As an author, you have to do some bits. Uh, it's a very cluttered space. Publishing fiction today is a hugely cluttered space. And there are only a couple of ways that you can stand above the clutter. Either your writing is strong and solid, it'll be a slow burn,
Mhm.
but if it reaches the audiences and it reaches the right audiences, uh, then it'll click. I think social media marketing is useful. You can use Amazon marketing quite successfully. It's a era of digital marketing, so use that. Depending on the budgets available to you, yeah, billboard could be a great idea if your budgets permit. Why not go for a small commercial if your budgets are much larger? Go for a television spots to promote your book, which happens. There are posters that people put out. There are newspaper adverts that can come out. It's all a function of the budget and the kind of outcome that you're looking at. Uh, but in the end, it's the solid writing that'll always win over. Look at Gitanjali Shri. She's been writing books for 30, 40 years. It's only the Booker for the Tomb of Sands a few years back that has brought her into limelight. And now some of her older books are selling well. So I think either you be a flash in the pan,
Mhm.
or you become that consistent star in the sky where you keep day in and day out shining from far away.
That's a great way to put it. So, and we started off this conversation by talking about how you wrote book in the second person narrative and how you'd written 60% of the book and then scrapped it and again gone back to the beginning. For someone who wants to write a book in the second person narrative, what would your advice be?
to personify something, or keep an audience in the mind, or you put yourself in the shoes of the protagonist who's talking, and then write. So for example, if Mahesh is writing and talking about Frida, as an author, you become Mahesh, and you assume an entity in front of you and consider that entity as Frida when you're writing or talking to Frida, or you put an entity as Alfie when you're talking to Alfie, and so on and so forth. So I think it's the author who has to go through that process where he or she uh, picks up the role of the narrator and speaks to an audience which could be the character. And I think always consider that character uh, as one from the audience so that you're able to connect with that um, person that you're speaking with. I think um, from the second person perspective, that becomes extremely important to have a conversation, right? To have a conversation with somebody who's sitting opposite you. It could be metaphorically in your head, but yeah, that really works when you're writing in second person. Have a view of who you're talking to, and then write.
So more like a conversation instead of telling a story.
It's more a conversation, and um, fall in love with the audience that you're writing to, right?
Yes.
And then it'll pull out all the right emotions for you to be able to communicate with that character. You can't treat them clinically as experiments to write your book. You need to have yourself emotionally invested in them to be able to write impactfully.
Very true. So as one final request, could you please give us some book recommendations for people who love stories about love triangles?
Oh, wow. um, I think if you love stories about love triangles, the one that I have read so many times is the book called Love in the Times of Cholera.
Yes.
By Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I think it's my all-time favorite. If you enjoy uh, a love triangle kind of a story, read that one. The language is lyrical. It's beautifully written. The characterizations are absolutely wonderful. So yeah, read that one.
I second your recommendation. What a lovely book. It's one of my all-time favorites also.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That brings us to our end of our conversation. Thank you so much, Dinesh, for speaking to me and providing so much insight into your writing process and the book itself. I'm sure if there are any new authors out there who are watching this, they've definitely taken down some notes, and they should for their future work. So thank you so much, Dinesh. It was lovely having you here.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you.
And to all our watchers out there, if you have not already read All Men Are Worshippers, what are you waiting for? Go ahead, buy yourself a copy, and don't forget to tag Dinesh and Bound and let us know what you thought about this lovely book. Until next time.